Hello, I'm Chris Salisbury, and today I'm talking to Trish Greenhalgh. Trish is Professor of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford, and she's well known not only for research on a wide range of subjects, but also for her ability to communicate with a wide audience, including thousands of followers on social media. So, Trish, thanks very much for doing the interview.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've had a really interesting career, and you've got a really wide range of intellectual interests, and I'm interested to know where that comes from. Can you tell us a bit about your background? I think you was the first person to go to university in your family.
No, not quite. I've got a
Not quite.
brother a year older who went off to university before me. But yeah, we were, I suppose, what they call a non-traditional family. Certainly, my father was the eldest of about eight kids, brought up in a council estate in Coventry, all that kind of thing. And most of them were boys. I think it was six boys. Um, and they all sort of went into the military, didn't they? You did your national service and things like that. And but basically, his family was sort of working class, working in factories in the Midlands. Um, my mum um, was she worked in the post office for a bit, but basically she was probably from a lower middle class family, and there was no tradition of going to university. But I think that was the same with an awful lot of people who were born in the late 50s, early 60s. Hardly any of their parents had been to university. Anyway, my dad really liked traveling around and moving the entire family with four kids to a new town about once a year and getting a job. And so I actually went to 18 different schools. Um,
Wow.
and I think when that is your childhood, when you don't have deep roots, but you travel around a lot and you get thrown into a new environment and it's sink or swim, you do develop a broad range of interests, but also a broad range of survival instincts. My dad liked traveling, so we spent a couple of years in America where we got a job in the States. And then we came back again and went to school in the UK again, and then we went off to Australia for a couple of years. And I have great memories of Nelson Bay Primary School in New South Wales. It was one of my
Mm.
favorite experiences. Anyway, came back to the UK when I was about 11, and then it was much more conventional actually. Then I went to the local grammar school and ended up going to Cambridge when I was 18, Clare College. But it was my early childhood that got me into, let's see what everyone's doing in that part of town or in that department. When I was at Cambridge, once a week I used to go to a lecture of a different subject and see what's going on in maths, what's going on in history. And I'm sure that was because my dad kept uprooting us and taking us places, and I rather enjoyed it. And I think that's probably what made me quite extrovert as well.
And sort of intellectual curiosity. So, because along the way you did an integrated degree in social and political science, which I imagine was unusual at Cambridge then for a doctor. Why that subject?
Yes, so Cambridge was very, very enlightened. So I went to Cambridge in 77 to 80. And I think even now it's possible to do pretty much any subject you like in your third year. So you do your preclinical subjects, and then mostly the medics will do something like immunology or anatomy or whatever it might be. Um, but sometimes some of the medics think, oh no, I'll do an arts subject or I'll do a social science subject. And I mean, you've got to take yourself back to 1979. It was the most amazing time for the social sciences at Cambridge. Um, and it was really, really, really exciting because some of the things kind of learnt about as the sort of marginal things like the social determinants of health in the medical teaching. Once you got into the social and political sciences, you could see how that fitted in, or how the social determinants, you could provide much richer explanations if you went in and theorized it properly. And to be honest, that was so formative. sometimes I think of myself even now as a social scientist who happens to have a medical degree rather than as a medic who happens to have done a year of social sciences. You know, most of my PhD students are not medical. They are studying the social sciences or how the social sciences impact on health.
And that's interesting because when I think of your research, one of the things that characterizes it is it's often really theoretically based. There's a clear theoretical structure or concept, and that's not true of a lot of medical research. You know, when I've sat on research boards, we all say it's important there's a theory, but in practice, the theory is pretty obscure sometimes, whereas
Well,
it's
I think
often
the
very
other thing,
evident.
I sit on those boards too, Chris, and I
Yeah,
think one of the problems with the contemporary research landscape is it is so easy now to cherry pick theories that you don't really understand and drop them into your grant.
yeah,
And so you kind of look through some grant application, it'll have the theory of planned behavior, and you look at it and you think, you just cut and pasted that. You don't even know what it is. Um, and that's quite problematic. I aspire to doing research that is theoretically grounded, but also interdisciplinary. Because the other side of that, and I don't know whether we're getting ahead of ourselves here, is the sociological literature is often biology blind.
hmm
In other words, they're really good at the social theory, but wait a minute, the clinical stuff's all wrong. The clinical stuff's all wrong. And I could give you lots of examples of that. And so you've the social scientists have to be in dialogue with the clinicians, and each has to value the other's perspective.
hmm
Same for the humanities, same for physicists. I mean, it doesn't matter who we're working with, we've all got to recognize and value the input of the other disciplines. And that's something I've really tried to do in
yeah.
30 years of leading a research unit.
And I can see that. And as you say, we've jumped ahead because I'll come back to your research a bit later. But just go back to your career a minute. You started a career in hospital diabetes and then you did your doctorate. So why the change from hospital medicine to becoming an academic GP?
Yes, so well, I think we have to bring in sport because the thing that was driving the jobs I was applying for when I was a junior doctor was, could this fit in with training? So I was keen on sport. I was a triathlete. I was swimming, cycling, and running. I swam a lot at university, and
Mm,
then everyone cycles around if you live in Oxford or Cambridge, and then the running just got added, and I made it into the British triathlon team. And so,
wow.
as far as I was concerned, any job would do. So you have to put that in perspective. And the job that came up was a research job at the Whittington Hospital in London, looking at the effects of stress on the control of type 1 diabetes. And I thought that'll do. Doesn't sound like there'd be a lot of on call. I can do my kind of swimming and cycling and running and all that, and this research job. And interesting, it was kind of weird. So what I had to do, and this was a piece of work that had already been planned out before they advertised for the person whose PhD it was going to be. What I had to do was get two groups of people with type 1 diabetes. One group were very stable. They were sort of well-behaved patients whose HbA1cs were perfect, although HbA1c hadn't been invented then. So, but you know what I mean. Um, and then there was another group who were known at the time as brittle, meaning, and I think I changed it to labile because brittle didn't seem like the right. Anyway, we had well controlled and not very well controlled people with diabetes. But it was the control day that changed my life because I then had 5 hours sitting next to someone with type 1 diabetes, listening to their stories. And they told me the story of why their diabetes was either well controlled or poorly controlled.
Mm,
And I remember going to my very biomedically oriented PhD supervisor and saying, I've got the hypothesis. He said to me, you've got 6 months, you've got to come up with a hypothesis. So I said, the hypothesis I got is that the narrative of what happens at and around diagnosis of type 1 diabetes powerfully influences whether the patient subsequently becomes either stable or brittle. And I remember my boss turned around to me when gave him that hypothesis, and he looked at me and he said, "Have you ever thought of becoming a GP?"
Hmm.
And what he was saying was, you have strayed right out of proper science. That doesn't even count as a hypothesis. You have wasted the entire time. I'm giving up on you. Go into general practice. But actually, that's not what I heard. What I heard was, you have got a phenomenally important hypothesis, and the place to explore this hypothesis is in the world of primary care, in the real world where people live, where context matters. Um, Now, the other thing that was happening, as well as studying sort of basically young adults, and mostly young white adults at the time, this is the mid 80s, with type 1 diabetes, I was also contracted to do the diabetic clinics. And when I went into, and I was also on call for diabetic emergencies, actually. Anyway, I went to the clinic twice a week. Clinic is full of British Bangladeshi patients with
Mm.
type 2 diabetes,
Yeah.
most of whom didn't speak English at the time because they'd not long migrated. And in that context, they were experiencing great difficulty getting jobs. They were badly paid, their rents were high, and all sorts of issues around what kind of food that they were able to get. Anyway, so I got really interested in this, and I spent probably 20 years working with the Bangladeshi community in the East End of London. And I don't want to put myself up as the person who led this, because I was just kind of hanging out and joining in initiatives that were actually being led by the Bangladeshi community themselves. I wrote a grant application to the Wellcome Trust explaining that I had started off with a very biochemical, biomedical view of stress, looking at counter-regulatory hormones and insulin absorption and all that. And even during that, the most powerful data I was getting was narratives about what was happening in people's lives, but also in the clinic. I was hearing stories like, whenever I go back to Bangladesh, my diabetes just gets completely better. And if you say to people, why is your diabetes so out of control? The answer will come in the shape of life challenges and what we now would call social determinants, but also the structural disadvantages of what kind of food it is possible to get, the issues around food insecurity, etc., etc. So the segue couldn't have been neater, really.
Mm.
Wellcome thought this was great. They funded uh, me. This was my first. I wasn't allowed to be principal investigator because I was too junior, so I had to kind of get some guy to front it who was a senior lecturer, but he didn't do a great deal. And then what we did was we hired a Bangladeshi anthropologist. So he'd got a PhD in Bangladeshi kinship networks, of all things. And he was well connected with the Bangladeshi community. And he interviewed 40 Bangladeshi people. We got some really interesting stories. We wrote what was my first major research paper around the narratives of British Bangladeshi people with type 2 diabetes. Anyway, it got rejected by the BMJ 3 times, and I kept appealing. And eventually they published it, and then it won Research Paper of the Year, which was quite
Mm.
funny.
So,
So
so
that was my
yeah,
transition from hospital to general practice. And of course, you can imagine, as a fellow GP, you can imagine the frustration of trying to manage people's diabetes in a hospital clinic when you're not really allowed to sort of get too involved in what's going on in their lives.
yeah, absolutely. So
Um,
that explains some of your recurring interest in diabetes, in narrative medicine. That all fits with. But just to change the subject a bit, perhaps your first claim to fame, at least the first time I knew about you, was with the publication of your book, How to Read a Paper, in 1997, which got serialized in the BMJ, and I think it's now in its seventh edition. So
Seventh edition,
how did
yeah.
that come about?
Well, when I so my second son was born in January 92, and then I had a few months off, as you do. And when I went back I was working at UCL at the time, and I went back to work. And you know, when you come back after having a baby and things start kind of feel like they're a bit different, and you feel like you've got imposter syndrome because the only thing you think about is nappies and milk and all that kind of thing. A lot of women watching this
I know
relate.
that. Mm.
So I thought, oh, blimey, I've got to kind of get up to speed. What is new? What is happening? So I went to, I think it's so in Nazareth, and said, well, come on then, what's been going on since I since I went away? And he said, oh, there's this new thing, evidence-based medicine. I thought, oh, blimey. That on top of everything else, because it was bad enough just getting back into kind of going to the office. So I've got this book, Dave Sackett's Big Red Book.
Mhm.
And it was like, oh my goodness, it was this big. It was like a blooming Bible. And I couldn't get my head around it. And then we discovered that Dave Sackett had been shipped over to Oxford, and he was running these 1 week courses of how to do it, how to teach it, how to do it. So I thought, oh, I'd go on one of them. So I went on that course in Oxford in, I think it was summer 1995. I remember sitting in the sunshine under trees and meeting amazing people who I'm still friends with, like Rory Milne was in my group, Aileen Clark was in my group, Glyn Elwyn was in my group. We're all still mates. And that was 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. Anyway, I thought, okay, not only do I personally need to know this stuff, but so does every practitioner, not just doctors, blah, blah, blah. But Dave Sackett was running these courses once a year, and there were only 100 places, and you had to really scrabble to get the places. And I said to Dave, well, why don't I set up a winter version in London? And so for 10 years, I ran this evidence-based medicine 1 week workshop. And because I became the person running the workshop, I suppose people started thinking I knew what I was talking about. And I did pick up on it. I wouldn't say I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm not
Mm.
um, good at the stats. I'm good enough at the stats because you don't need to be very good. Anyway, early on in that very first London workshop on EBM, everyone was coming up to me and saying something that really resonated, which was this big red book of Dave Sackett's. Can't understand a word of it. It's kind of written from an epidemiologist's perspective. Um, I need something. So I made a set of lecture notes. They were never going to be a book. That's where it
Okay.
came from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you became associated with the evidence-based medicine movement, but my memory of that was that you were arguing for a more nuanced approach and appreciation of different sorts of evidence, and saying it's not as
Oh,
simple as
goodness.
always the randomized controlled trial.
Well, it's really interesting. If I answer that rather than answer it from where I was then, if I answer it from where I am now, um, I'm only alive because of a randomized controlled trial.
Mm.
So I'm a cancer survivor. I have been through some pretty horrible realizations of not only do you have cancer, but you've got a very fast growing cancer. It's actually quite a rare form of something. And luckily for you, there is a particular drug that has been, it's kind of designer drug for the molecule that your cancer is putting out. And the randomized controlled trial shows that it works. So you've got to have this. And that was years ago.
Mm.
I've been cured for years.
Mm.
Now, once you've been through that, you're not going to stand up on a soapbox and say there's that randomized controlled trials are inherently bad. They are not inherently bad. The best evidence to show whether a drug works for a particular defined denominator population without any shadow of doubt is a randomized controlled trial. That does not, however, mean that whatever the question, the best answer is a randomized controlled trial. And it also does not mean that randomized controlled trials are bias free. They are not bias free. But in terms of evaluating the efficacy of drug treatments, there's nothing better.
But the key point is that it's not the right answer to every type of question, and I think that's a point you've made before.
Well, that's one thing. And the other thing is, possibly as importantly, you don't just need randomized controlled trials. So the big mistake that some of the EBM hardliners made was they made two mistakes. One was they even though they say they don't, they actually do think that the RCT is the best kind of evidence for everything. But the other thing they did was they say, if we have RCTs, we can ignore all the other evidence. And they can't for all sorts of reasons. But just to give you one soundbite, the RCT does not tell you about context. So you need, even if you're in the middle of an RCT, you need other methods to give you the context. And so you might, for example, have a process evaluation of an RCT which collects qualitative data, just for example. But there's hundreds and hundreds of research questions for which the RCT is not the best method. And the big problem with EBM right now is that because the EBM, its star is still in the ascendancy, it's very hard to get that message across.
Okay. So then in 2010, you became a professor at Queen Mary's in London, leading a unit on healthcare innovation and policy. And at that time, you were writing quite a lot about diffusion of innovation and knowledge translation. What do you think are the most important?
Yeah, I got my first chair at UCL in 2000, 2001.
Right.
And I was doing a lot of work on diffusion of innovations at that point. We published a paper in 2004, which is still the most highly cited paper that I've ever written in Millbank Quarterly. It was very influential. I think it's fair to say that. And we did a systematic review. It wasn't a Cochrane review because we had evidence from all sorts of topic areas, from sociology to economics to business and management to socio-technical studies, goodness knows. And we had to pull all that together. And we came up with a model for diffusion of innovations, which Laura Damschroeder subsequently kind of tidied up, and it became the consolidated framework for implementation research. But we were trying to answer the question that was very prevalent at the time. If you have an innovation that works here, how come it's so hard for it to spread elsewhere? And we're still asking that. You go to one hospital or one GP practice and think, wow, you guys are doing something really cool, but why isn't the practice down the road doing something similar? So there's one thing which is the development of innovation, but there's the spread and the sustainability of innovation. And one thing that I got quite interested in the early 2000s was the lack of research literature on non-adoption and abandonment. And I thought, gosh, I could have a job for life here, looking at why innovations are not adopted and why they're abandoned. And then, as you say, I moved to Queen Mary about 2010, and no, it was before that because we just published it. It was before I moved to Queen Mary. We were looking at the National Programme for IT in England, and there had been an app called Health Space, and we had got one of the things that we'd been asked to do, or we bid and got the contract to do, was evaluate this thing called Health Space, and absolutely nobody had adopted it. In 2 years studying Health Space, I only ever met one person who'd used it. It was that bad. How the heck do you do a research project on why nobody's heard of it? If they've heard of it, they didn't want to use it. Nobody wants to be interviewed. It was like, this is a non-event. And so I got really, really interested. And subsequently, when I was at Queen Mary, we developed something called the NAS framework, which is non-adoption, abandonment, and challenges to spread, scale up, and sustainability. So it's very much basically saying, you want to explain your failed technology project in the NHS, use the NAS framework.
I was going to ask you for a kind of very brief summary of what do you think are the key things that lead to things getting adopted or not. But in the interest of time, because I'm conscious of the time moving on, we'll put a link to people to read the NAS framework, and that will be an
Yeah,
answer.
there's a load of tools actually. There's something called the NASCAT tools. I mean, I will
Mm.
give you just a very brief comment on it, is that the whole thing is very complex. It's not, here's your barriers and here's your facilitators. Do not send me a barriers and facilitators paper to peer review, because you cannot make a list of barriers and facilitators. And the reason is that something that's a barrier in one project might actually be a facilitator somewhere else. It's about the whole totality of the story and whether things fit together and all that kind of thing. And you've got all the NAS framework is a few domains for you to think about stuff and discuss it and deliberate on it. But one of the things that we developed from that was a complexity assessment tool, CAT. And so the NAS-CAT tools are a set of structured documents where you might, for example, download the short version of the NASCAT tool and take it into your board meeting and say, let's do a quick NASCAT assessment about whether this technology is likely to flop.
Um, that probably links what we've just been talking about to your interest in digital innovations and remote consultations, that I know you've done lots of work on that. Is that how you got into that, because of that interest in why things don't get adopted?
Oh, partly, yeah. So I have been interested in, I mean, I am interested in why things do get adopted as well.
Hmm.
So it was partly due to my diabetes work in the East End of London. And there were two amazing, amazing people working in Newham Hospital. One was called Shanti Vijayaraghavan, who well, they're both originally from India, but Shanti was director of research and she was also the head of diabetes at Newham. And she was passionate about research, but research that helped the local community. And so she was already running things like research days where she'd invite the local population of Newham to hear about the research and to help plan research. So she was really cool. The other person who was interested in introducing video consultations at Newham was Satya Bhattacharya. He was a liver surgeon, still is, and his issue was that people who came to him for their liver surgery weren't really well enough to keep coming back for their follow-up appointments, because when you've had your liver replaced, you're not feeling very well and you quite like to stay at home. So because Satya was a kind of regional liver surgeon, so Shanti wanted to introduce video consultations for diabetes, because a lot of her patients couldn't get the time off work to come because they were working in the gig economy and all that kind of thing. Satya wanted to introduce video consultations for a completely different reason. And Shanti and Satya are married to each other and they're very cool people. And so I became friends with them and we said, let's put in a bid to see if we can get some money to set up video consultations by Skype. And this was in about 2008. But then we got funded to look at Skype video consultations in Newham Hospital. We were the first people. We did it in Newham. It was not led by the kind of super duper people in the centre, if you like. It was in a very deprived part of London, and it was driven by these two passionate clinicians.
Mm.
And
Okay.
then I was coming along saying, I can give you the theoretical underpinning. And we had a lot of fun and we did the vocal project. And then we did a few more of those studies. But fast forward nearly 10 years, the pandemic was happening. I was already sitting on the National Primary Care Digital Transformation Team Advisory Board. And then what we had was, if you remember back in March 2020, I got a phone call from Minard Baikal saying, Trish, we've got to get the whole of general practice to a remote model in 3 weeks because of the pandemic. And I'm going, oh yeah, we know how to do that. We've done it. Yeah, we know all the challenges. We've done the research. It's going to be complex. this is actually a socio-technical transformation. Do not think of this as a plug and play. And then yeah, as you know, Chris, UK primary care successfully flipped to remote with remarkably few hiccups given what was going on in the pandemic.
I was going to ask you about the pandemic because my memory of that time was you became very engaged in public debate and sometimes quite heated debate about airborne transmission and the effectiveness of masks. And I might have been quite hesitant to get involved in that, thinking this isn't really my field, and I don't know about this. But you don't seem to hesitate to apply yourself, learn about a subject, contribute to debate. Why?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I'm very hesitant to comment on things that I don't really know about. I think it's really, really important when you are an expert in one or two fields that you have to recognize that you're not an expert in everything. So let's foreground that. The problem, I think, was a little bit more meta than that. What I was doing, initially, I was working within the biomedical frame, within the sort of Cochrane reviews, rapid Cochrane reviews, and when well, when the pandemic happened, people were sending questions in, and one of the questions people were sending was, well, how do we avoid transmitting it? How do we avoid catching it? That was the big question. And very quickly, I got to know some physicists. Lydia Boruiba helped us with one of our questions, which was, it was a paper written by Nick Jones, 2 meters or one. Should we be 2 meters distant or 1 meter distance when we're socially distancing? And this was a daft question. I realized after we chased it down and realized that there wasn't any evidence for either 2 meters or 1 meter, and everyone was putting those stickers on the ground, and it was all, where did this come from? I realized that the physicists could answer it. There's a journal called Indoor Air,
Mhm.
and there was a whole group of physicists who'd spent their entire lives studying the transmission of particles in indoor air. And staggeringly, the infectious diseases people were not taking any notice of that. And I remember a World Health Organization committee meeting, which bizarrely I was attending, so we were all doing it online. I wasn't a member of that committee, but I was filling in for somebody else and representing some whatever. And I saw in the chat all these infectious diseases people who were making these major decisions that were going to affect millions and millions of people worldwide. And I put in the chat, here is a link to what the physicists are up to. And I got a message back from a public health doctor from the UK who was on that committee, or maybe, a guest at that committee, saying, no, that's not high quality evidence. We need RCTs. And I thought, yes, it is high quality evidence. It's really high quality evidence. It's about the physics of particle transmission in indoor air. And then I realized, so it wasn't that I became an expert in airborne transmission. It was, I recognized that there are experts in airborne transmission who were not being listened to because evidence-based medicine's hierarchy of evidence was dominating. And I need to declare a conflict of interest here. I lost a parent to hospital-acquired COVID. So I've got skin in the game here.
Mhm.
Um, my son was a junior doctor. He was one of the first people in the UK to get COVID because he was on the
Mhm.
front line at the Royal Free, receiving people and all that kind of thing. Hospital-acquired COVID transmission was a particular issue for me personally,
Mhm.
but also the and you look at the COVID inquiry, the module 3 of the COVID inquiry, they said one of the really big problems which led to many thousands of avoidable deaths was the sort of arrogance of the infectious diseases community not listening to the physicists and refusing to accept that this disease was airborne. So yes, I was quite passionate about that.
Mm.
But in a way, I initially said to the mask people, no, I don't know enough about masks. And then I thought, I have an ethical duty to learn about masks.
Mm.
If people are looking to me to say, well, what should we be doing? It wasn't just masks, it was masks,
Yeah.
ventilation, it was what should we be doing? And of course, if we'd had a proper mask mandate in place earlier, um, actually we could have locked down for much less time. The economy wouldn't have been so badly affected, etc., etc., etc.
But and I suppose that debate all happened on social media. And part of the reason you've got such a high profile is because of your social media following it. At the time, you had about 170,000 followers on Twitter, though I know you've now moved mainly to Blue Sky. And you seem to document it seems to be quite a lot of your whole life on social media. So I feel I know about your son as a marine biologist in Fiji and about your love of wild swimming. And that's been a theme throughout your career because you used to write columns in the BMJ for social media. So where does this enthusiasm to communicate come from? Is it something you enjoy, or is it something you just can't
Yeah, I
help
suppose so.
doing, or is it something you feel's your role, or what?
I don't know. Well, interestingly, I was actually a bit slow getting onto Twitter. I remember when I thought it was all a bit trivial and it would distract people from the real world and all the rest of it. And then I've quite quickly realized that if you give people interesting things to read, they start following you. And so I think it's just fun. It's just a hobby.
When it's fun, or I kind of feel that you can't help yourself almost, that you just feel you have to be out there. It's something about you. Is that
Well,
right?
yeah, but I think the other thing, it's worth saying that social media was really important during the pandemic, in the early phase of
Absolutely.
the pandemic, because what we did was we recruited people into research. And I did this bit of research, we did fast track ethics approval. We said, well, we got 72 GPs to tell us what it was like diagnosing COVID over the phone. Because you
Mhm.
remember when you were
Mhm.
probably practicing yourself, like people would phone up. And I remember one of my colleagues saying, I can diagnose it over the phone now because of the quality of the cough.
Mhm.
I think, oh, well, let's capture that. And so we
Mhm.
did these online focus groups and we
Mhm.
wrote a paper and we developed a scale and all the rest of it. And people said they had this score that we developed based on all this wisdom that came from the GPs. People had it stuck on the wall, and the things that you could ask people that would help in the phone assessment. But anyway, we did all that. We recruited on Twitter, so Twitter wasn't just a hobby. It wasn't just a kind of platform for me to get stuff out. It was also a platform for me to learn stuff.
Mhm. So we must come to an end. What do you do outside work?
Um, Well, like I say, I'm a grandmother now. I mean,
Well done.
serious stuff. I've got a toddler
Congra-
grandkid.
Congratulations.
I am a wild swimmer. I'm usually in the river in the summer, swimming up and down.
Hmm.
Very early in the morning, I am doing a lot in work and outside work with AI.
Hmm.
Actually, I'm looking at AI in enhancing academic work, in doing the intellectual labor. I don't think AI is intelligent, but I do think it does intellectual labor, doing the intellectual labor that can support advanced academic thinking. Um, and yeah, I kind of do that outside work as well as inside work because it's
Hmm.
also very interesting designing all these AI tools. So
Hmm.
there's a bit of a nerd in me there. And I still do a lot of sport, do a lot of
Hmm.
cycling, do a lot of
Trish, it's fascinating to talk to you. What really comes across is your just intellectual curiosity. That's another new thing, the AI story. And there's so many different things you've done over your career. And we could talk for ages, but thank you so much for giving your time this morning. It's lovely to talk to you.
And thank you very much for having me. Good luck with the series, Chris.